Have you experienced sensory overload? Pop your answer in the comments. Did you know that 1 in every 6 children has sensory processing difficulties? This can be more of a problem for specific groups such as autism spectrum disorder groups, such as sensory processing disorder groups, such as fetal alcohol syndrome groups. And there are many other groups that sensory processing and overload affects. Sensory overload occurs when the brain is struggling to interpret the sensory information that's coming into it through all of our senses. It's struggling to prioritize those bits of information coming through to our sensory system and trying to prioritize which one's more important than another, and where does this one need to go in the mix of things, and what signal does the brain need to get first. And so it kind of causes mass amounts of overload. The brain kind of just sits there and goes, can't do this, don't want to go there, I'm just gonna stop functioning. And we end up getting this overload then, because the brain literally kind of shuts down like a computer does. When we've got too many tabs open on the internet and the internet seems to stop working and our computer seems to freeze, that's kind of the same experience for children who experience sensory overload. Their brain's done the same sort of thing, where it's just shut down and gone, there's too much information coming in, I can't interpret this, I can't prioritize this, I don't know what I'm doing with it. And so it shuts down and it tries to reset itself. Often these feelings for a child who's experiencing this kind of overload cause them to feel a bit of discomfort. It can cause them to panic. And so that only adds to the overload. What sort of things cause sensory overload? Well, to be perfectly honest, there are lots of them, and the things that cause sensory overload for one child could be very different to the things that cause sensory overload for another child. I know that for my two, it is completely different. My oldest struggles with lots of noises and continual noise, and my youngest, noise bothers him, but not in the same way that it bothers my oldest. He can deal with himself being loud, but he can't deal with other people being loud. So sensory overload can affect people in very different ways, and what affects one doesn't necessarily affect another. That's part of what makes sensory overload challenging, especially in classrooms. So things that can affect sensory overload are things like sudden or continual noises. They can be sudden or continual loud noises. They can just be sudden or continual noises. So for instance, I get overloaded with my youngest because he literally can sit there and talk to me for 20 minutes nonstop, and it gets to the point where my brain just shuts off and I'm like, I actually can't do this anymore. So that's one factor that adds to sensory overload for a lot of people, is just sudden noises, loud noises, continual noises. Another thing that causes sensory overload for a lot of us is things like being in crowded places. You know, there's so many places today that are so busy, so full on, and there's just lots and lots of people around. And crowds affect a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. The more common ones, especially for children, are the fact that there is lots going on and lots for their brain to process, and their brain just can't do that. Another reason for public and crowded spaces causing sensory overload is simply the fact that you're in a crowded space and often you're brushing up against other people as you're walking through the mall or as you're walking through the streets of your town, going into shops. So there are lots of things to bump into you, lots of things for you to bump into, and it's hard to try and process exactly where you need to be in enough time to be there so you don't bump into people, so you don't feel like you're crowded in and like everything is squashing in on you and pushing the breath out of you. So being in crowded or overstuffed rooms, rooms that have a lot of items in them, things like that, they all add to sensory overload. One of the other things that adds to sensory overload and makes things more challenging is emotions. Emotions are such a difficult thing for us as adults to deal with and to process and to work through, and especially in appropriate ways. So it's even harder for children to actually work through those emotions and process emotions and deal with them in an appropriate way. And so when they have to deal with intense emotions, whether it's intense emotions from somebody else that they're talking to or being around, or whether it's intense emotions in that they're experiencing intense emotions, it overloads their system, and their system tends to shut down because it just doesn't know how to handle the situation and what to do anymore. So emotional challenges definitely add to sensory overload for children. So bear that in mind with a classroom where you've got lots of kids experiencing different emotions. If you have a child who has things like sensory processing disorder, things like autism, they're neurodiverse, all of those sorts of things will have an added impact on their ability to manage themselves and to not get overloaded. Children who have neurological disorders and processing disorders often experience overload in a bigger, more intense way than your regular children will. So one of the other things that we know adds to sensory overload for children in particular is changes to things. So changes to an environment, or changes to weather, or changes to the plans of the day. Any of those sorts of things can often cause overload for children. One of the reasons this is because it's in their heads, they've processed the plans that you've given them for the day, and now suddenly something changes, and now everything they had worked out in their head, everything they had set up for themselves to help them cope, now goes out the window. And now they're in a position where they suddenly have to very quickly make a new plan, and they don't necessarily feel like they have the time to make that new plan. And so changes to environments or changes to schedules or routines can cause a lot of overload. So bear that in mind in a classroom setting and a classroom situation. If you have children who you know can get overloaded easily, if there are changes to plans, make sure they're aware of that well in advance. So there are lots and lots of things that can cause overload, and one of the biggest things I found that causes overload, especially for children with things like autism, sensory processing disorder, and things like that, is physical contact. You know, everybody thinks that getting a cuddle is a great way to calm a child and a great way to connect with a child. But for children who are a little bit different and wired differently, that's not necessarily going to be the case. And for a lot of children with autism and sensory processing disorder and things like that, physical contact doesn't quite work the same way that it does for a normal child. Often there's things like when you go to hug a child or you go to touch them on the shoulder, they get a fright, or it creates a tingling sensation in their skin that they don't like. And it creates sensations and feelings that they've then got to process, and adds to the dilemma of sensory processing overload. I know that in our house, I like to get hugs, and I like hugs that are just gentle and calming and they relax you. But if I was to approach my youngest, who's autistic and ADHD, and I was to give him just a gentle hug like I like, for him that causes massive amounts of overload. He doesn't like that, and it makes him feel uncomfortable. Sensory overload can cause children to become anxious, and they may try and avoid the activity or the environment that is causing the sensory overload and causing them to feel more anxious and more uncomfortable. They can also tend to be experiencing anxiety to the point where it triggers a panic attack for them. And so that's a lot harder to bring a child back from than just anxiety and sensory overload. So keeping in mind that sensory overload can cause anxiety, especially in crowded environments like public spaces or in classrooms, more so than at home, and having some plans and things in place to help with that. Key things to look out for in children who are experiencing anxiety and sensory overload, to try and prevent them getting to the point where they end up in a panic attack, are things like you might see a child clenching their fists and then unclenching them, and clenching their fists and unclenching them. That's a response to, I'm anxious, I'm not sure what to do, and it's something their body just naturally tends to do. You might also find that children fidget more. You might see them playing with jewelry they might be wearing, swirling bracelets or playing with watches. You might see them moving around the classroom a little bit more than they normally would, or moving in their seats more than they normally would. These are all signs that something more might be going on and that they might be experiencing sensory overload or anxiety, or a combination of both. One of the key things that I look for in children is hyperventilating. If a child is hyperventilating, that's your key sign that you need to stop what you're doing and get that child to their safe space, get them to do some regulation, because the hyperventilating is a sign that the anxiety or the overload is extreme and they're at the point where they can no longer cope with this, and their strategies, if they're using them, aren't working. And so they need more support and they need more help at that point so that they don't end up triggering into a panic attack. Having an environment that is sensory friendly and not going to overload the senses too much is absolutely essential. It's vital that, especially in our learning environments, we create an environment that has a balance between sensory input and sensory overload. So having spaces within classrooms where it's a safe space for children to go if they're experiencing sensory overload. It's a space where they're not going to experience sensory overload, and it has tools and resources that can help children to regulate and to calm down. Because without that balance, kids' brains aren't going to function, kids aren't going to learn in the classroom environment, and they're not going to make any progress because the brain's just continually shutting down. The brain's continually going, I can't deal with this, I can't figure out what you want, what's coming in, how it's coming in, and all this stuff just triggers more overload for a child who's already experiencing sensory overload. So having a classroom that balances out sensory input with sensory overload to avoid having sensory overload situations occurring on a regular basis is absolutely vital for children to learn. Experiencing sensory overload for children can be quite a traumatic experience. Part of that potentially traumatic experience is that children don't know necessarily why their body's responding the way it is, or what's causing it to respond the way that it is. And so for them, sensory overload can be quite traumatic because they don't know what's happening, they don't know what to do, and they don't know how to stop it sometimes. As a parent dealing with a child who's experiencing sensory overload, that can also be quite a traumatic experience because we're just not sure what we need to do sometimes, how we need to do it. We're not sure if an approach we'll use will work. So it can be quite a traumatic experience for us as well. What we can do is, as parents, we can teach our children coping strategies. So we can teach them to use breathing exercises or to use visualization exercises. These sort of things will work in most environments and they'll help with most sensory overloading situations. So helping to support our children to learn how to use those techniques, helping to support them by using those techniques with them when they're in the middle of an overload scenario, can help them to slowly learn to process that sensory overload in a different way and to be able to cope better and not be overloaded as easily. As teachers, you can create a sensory-friendly environment in your class that balances out sensory input so that there isn't necessarily going to be cases of daily sensory overload. Having a safe space in your classroom where children can go to that might have some sensory resources and some regulation resources is also a really good way of balancing out that sensory input with sensory overload. So it's really important to make sure that you've got those safe spaces, that your environment that you're in is sensory friendly. Otherwise, learning could be challenging for some of our children. As society, we also need to take a look at ourselves, and we need to adjust the way we think, the way we perceive, and the way we see some of these situations. Often we tend to see a parent with a child in a mall having a meltdown, and we look at that situation and we go, that's bad behavior. That child's throwing a tantrum. That parent hasn't learned how to parent their child properly, simply because they're not doing it the way we would do it, or they're not doing things the way that we would expect. But what we don't know is whether that meltdown is actually a child throwing a tantrum because the parent said no, they can't have their toy they want, or whether it's actually this child's in an environment that's overloading their sensory system. They've got to the point where they can't cope and their body and their brain have shut down and they're now dealing with this. And so while it might look like bad behavior, if you actually took a deeper look, it's not bad behavior. It's a child overloaded, unable to cope, and it's a parent trying to, in an intense situation with lots of people looking on and feeling, in some cases, judged, to deal with their child and to help them with their emotions, with their overload, and to help them to regulate. So as society, we need to be a little bit more open to learning about neurodiversity, learning about sensory processing disorder, learning about triggers, learning about concepts and things related to any of those sorts of challenging behavioral difficulties, neurodiversity, processing challenges, and learning what we can do to help support parents who might be in public spaces going through that. Share your experiences of sensory overload with us, whether it's experiences of how you cope, strategies that you use, what it looks like when your child experiences sensory overload. Let us know. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more content on child development.